Hey and welcome to Neverwinter with Aragon. So in this video I'd like to go over my rogue single target DPS build. So let's first start things off with your powers, as this is mainly the primary focus at which you need to get right to be able to maximize your damage. You're standardly using your Duelist Flurry to maximize your damage. Duelist Flurry has the added effect of stacking up bleed on your target, and this will help out a considerable amount with single target damage. Now, the thing with a rogue is you need to time this so that you always have bleed on your target, and then when you have bleed on your target, then you switch to using Gloam and Cut to maximize that damage. Right? So you're going to be switching between Duelist Flurry and your Gloam and Cut. You can see when you obtain those green sword markers on your target, that is when they have a bleed, and when that is on at about 5, that's when you need to do another Duelist Flurry and get it back to 10, and you continue attack. When you attack a boss, it's a lot easier to see since you'll have the bar up here at the top to be able to see those buffs and debuffs a lot easier. So that's your Duelist Flurry and your Gloam and Cut. No other reason why you would use these other two. Then with our encounter powers, I like to use Wicked Reminder, then Lashing Blade, and Assassinate. So what you will do is you will go and use Wicked Reminder to put this 10% damage debuff on the target. So we use Wicked Reminder, then we use Lashing Blade from Stealth, and then we use Assassinate. The reason behind this is because Wicked Reminder will first make it so that your target takes 10% extra damage. Then you will use Lashing Blade from Stealth, meaning that will add 50% additional crit severity to the attack. And when we look down here, we will obtain 10% more damage for 5 seconds after leaving Stealth. So that is when we go and we hit Assassinate with the 10% buff from Lashing Blade, using it with Stealth, and we have 10% from Wicked Reminder, meaning we gain a 20% buff with Assassinate, which we should then gain another 25% buff if you're behind the target. So you want to stack up all those, and that's your single target rotation. You use your Duelist Flurry to maximize that damage. When you see the bleeds are on your target, you begin using Gloam and Cut. Whenever your encounters are off cooldown, you need to start with Wicked Reminder, then Lashing Blade from Stealth, and then finally Assassinate. And that's it. Then you're back to Duelist Flurry, a few more Gloam and Cuts. Make sure just to have those bleeds up whenever they're dropping off, and you think you need to do another Duelist Flurry, go ahead and do so. Soon as Wicked Reminder's off, Lashing Blade and Assassinate. And that's your rotation for single target damage on a rogue. As for daily powers, you of course want to be using this Shocking Execution with 2200 magnitude. It also has the nice effect where you will obtain 50% of your action points back if you hit a target below 20% of its health. Then we move to our class features. I generally like to run with Skillful Infiltrator now, giving me that extra 2.5% critical strike. It does give movement speed, which is very nice, and it gives deflection, which is decent. And finally, we're also using Oppressive Darkness to obtain that extra damage whenever we deal combat advantage damage. It will be 20 extra magnitude on every hit, so as long as you're flanking your target, you'll have no problem to rack up the damage from Oppressive Darkness. Now of course there are other ones you can use, like I do like to use Tactics if I need more action point gain. Then finally, for our feats down the bottom here, you want to be using Toxic Blades to add up that damage buffs. The top one is just kind of not great at all. It's hard to juggle with, and Toxic Blade overall just a whole lot better damage there. Then we have Master of the Shadows, so you'll effectively gain a lot more stealth a lot more quicker. This is very good for fights to make sure you have the stealth for your Lashing Blade when it's off cooldown. Otherwise you may run into problems where you might not have your stealth if you've been getting hit for the Lashing Blade. You can always use the other one. I find it's just more reliable to have Master of the Shadows. Then we have Skullcracker, of course, to give that extra 10% damage on your target, and it will be a permanent uptime as long as you keep attacking your enemy. Then we have our Back Alley Tactics. You will effectively deal up to 10% more damage depending on how full your action points are. The lower they are, the more damage buff you gain from this. Then finally, you want to be using Shadow's Flurry to gain a 5% chance to spawn a Shadow Flurry figure, which will do the combo of Duelist Flurry giving you those extra bleeds. It's very nice just to help out with that. We're going to go and move on to our character statistics. What stats do you want to be obtaining to maximize your damage on a rogue? Well, you normally want to be racking up as much of this base damage as possible, and this is directly impacted through your item level. Increase your item level, the more damage you will have. Then we have our 5 offense stats here: power, accuracy, combat advantage, critical strike, and critical severity. You ideally want to get them all at 90%, however this is pretty much impossible, at least for long durations. So you want to be making sure to prioritize first power and combat advantage, then you want to be going critical strike and critical severity. Now accuracy does give a little bit higher damage buff when you're closer to 90% than like critical strike or combat advantage even, but since accuracy is very hard to stack up, I wouldn't worry about it and just focus on these other ones. So when we go into combat, according to what gear I have, we can get our stats to be pretty much at 90%, all except our accuracy. So we're going to go and look at our buffs here. We have our 90% power, our 90% combat advantage, and we nearly have our 90% critical strike. We'll just use some more encounters real quick, and we should get that 90% critical strike. There we go. And our 90% critical severity. And this is through the gear we have, which is what we will talk about next. So with regards to gear on a DPS character, there are a few specific ones you want to be using to maximize your damage. For example, these Garistro horns to gain these stacks of critical strike up to a maximum of 10%. On a rogue, it can actually in fact be quite hard to keep up these stacks. As you can see here, I'm having trouble keeping up the stacks of the Garistro horns, but you can generally keep up about 8 to 9 of those stacks, not much of a bother. And the reason being is that our Gloaming Cut is 1.1 second cast time rather than a 1 second cast time, and with the Garistro horns they require you to attack every 1 second at least to deal that amount of damage of 10% of your maximum hit points. Anyway, with that said, we then have the Bone Devil's Ribcage. It's a huge buff to damage on those stats. It gives 12.5% extra crit severity and 12.5% extra critical strike. That's massive once you have those stacks up to 5 there. With the arms, I'm using the Lion Guard ones. You can also use the Blessed ones, which you can get to 1260 item level, and it'll effectively give you 20 stacks of this power, which is nearly 5000 power, and it will allow you just to gain that extra damage and help you cap it out by giving you the power rating. Then we have for our feet, we have the Rusted Iron Leggings. We've been using them for quite some time now, and they will give you 5% additional damage. If your healer is struggling to heal you, make sure to swap these out with something else. Then we have our weapons. The Mirage weapons is of course what you want to be using. There are other variants out there. If you refuse to use the Mirage or haven't bothered to grind them out, there is of course like the Lionheart ones, the Masterwork ones, the Celestial ones. They'll all do in single target, but the Mirage will be the best as of right now. Then for our rings, I definitely like to use these Diamond Rings of Spite, and they give you that 3% extra damage buff to your melee powers, and you can use 2 of them. As you can see, I have 2 Swordsman perks there. You can also get other rings like Master Rings of the Striker, which will also give you these 3% damage to your melee powers. You can get them from Undermountain, from in Tower of the Mad Mage, or just on the auction house from other players. As for my shirt, I'm using the Ebony Stained Assault shirt to give me 3% extra damage whenever my stamina is above 75%. Then our trousers, we're just using the highest item level 1 we can obtain. For our neck and waist set, we're running with the Starshed Choker, the Twinkle of the Stars, and also the Sparkling Fey Emblem, and gives us the buff much like the old Demon Lord set, where we'll effectively deal up to 10% additional damage depending on the difference between the hit point percentage of us and our target. Meaning, if our target is at 0% hit points and we're at 100%, we'll gain 10% additional damage. So that's pretty much it for the gear. As for the artifacts, you ideally want to have 3 Storyteller Journals to give you that extra buff of percentage power and also that additional hit for weapon damage on a critical hit, which is pretty nice. This is our weapon damage here, 6472, and whenever we crit, we'll deal this much damage. Of course, it will be resisted by the enemy's damage resistance, unfortunately. But other than these artifacts, just use some high item level ones like this Sparkling Fey Emblem. with item level 450, whereas the storyteller journals are only item level 300. So now we go to our enchantments. Which ones am I mainly using? Well, you can see I'm mainly using assassins to give that critical strike, accuracy, combat advantage, and combined rating. And we have pretty much all of them in our offense slots. As for our defense slots, I'm actually mainly using tactical enchantments. Tactical enchantments will increase my awareness, giving me more survivability against bosses, which always deal combat advantage damage, and awareness will reduce this, instead of increasing my hit points, which will just make it harder for me to gain these stacks from, let's say, the Gristro Horns and the Bone Devil's Ribcage. You can of course use anything you want there. Any defense stats will help. Then for our utility enchantments, you definitely want Darks to give you extra forte, which on a rogue, an assassin at least, it would give you power, combat advantage, and deflect severity. It's pretty decent to get that power and combat advantage, that extra percentage to get it to 90%. Then we have our weapon and armor enchantments. As my armor enchantment, I generally just run around with a bark shield. My plan isn't to get hit very often, and when I do get hit, I have the ability with this bark shield to block like 50,000 damage, so it's pretty nice. Then for our weapon enchantment in single target, you of course want to be using a Bilethorn. You can of course use a Vorpal, it's not so bad. It will help increase your crit and crit severity if you are lacking on those. So finally we go to modifications. In my main hand, I generally like to run with the Duelist Flurry. However, you can also use the modification of Enhanced Gloaming Cut. Either one doesn't particularly matter. You can look at your own combat logs at which deals the most damage. I tend to run with this Duelist Flurry as it gives me that extra bleed damage. Then in our offhand, I'm using what you can see here, recharge speed, to make sure these cooldowns go down a little bit more, and I'm also using enhanced accuracy just to balance these stats out. And in our gear here, you can see I'm using a modification of critical strike there, I'm using one of critical severity here, I'm using one of critical severity here, and on my boots I'm using another one of critical severity. On my neck and rings, I'm using just that combat advantage there. So now we move to our race and ability scores. You can see I'm currently a human, and the reason being is a human will give you 1% additional stat to all of your offense and defensive ones, meaning I'm gaining a total of 5% offense stats and a total of 5% defense stats. That's pretty good. However, of course, there are other races out there you can use, such as the Githyanki for 5% combat advantage. You can use the Wood Elf, I believe it's for 5% critical strike. You can also use like the Tiefling for 5% extra damage when your target's below 50% HP, and you can also use like the Dragonborn, etc. With that said, I'll go to my ability scores. I'll need to exit combat here to be able to actually click on it. But you can see I'm using dexterity and I'm using charisma. I'm mainly using dexterity to gain that critical severity. It's pretty decent in that way. I'm also using charisma to give forte and recharge speed. If you wish, and if you have critical severity aplenty, you can always switch to strength to gain that extra physical damage boost. It's very minimal, but every little helps there. So finally we go to companions. Now, as for your active companion, there are a good few you can use. For example, the Paranoid Delusion on a rogue is actually pretty decent. It's very comparable to the Cold Iron Warrior. I generally like to run with Xuna for a lot of content, and you can also use ones like the Eladrin as well for single target. There are a good few others. I recommend looking up my single target top 10 damage companion video, where I go over all the top 10 and I give a document which shows all the other ones listed that I have tested. Anyway, with our equipment, I'm just stacking combat advantage here. This is the new combat advantage companion gear, this one right here, 1300 item level. Ideally you would have those, but I'm just using two other ones from Undermountain with 1010. Ideally want to get the ones from the Redeemed Citadel, which have 1100. And in all of those offense slots, I'm running Indomitable Runestones to give me that extra damage for my companion. Now down here at the bottom for my enhancement power, I'm using Acute Senses, which gives me that extra combat advantage. Whenever you attack, there's a chance you will gain 7.5% extra combat advantage, and the uptime on these is actually surprisingly good. You'll generally always have this up. So you can use this enhancement power to like juggle around with what stat you need. For me, I needed combat advantage, so I chose acute senses. Gives me that extra 7.5% most of the time while in combat. In my defense slot, I'm using a face spider to give me critical chance and combat advantage. In my universal slot here, I'm using a Batiri for 11% extra damage against bosses, and then I'm using a black dragon ion stone in my offense slot for 7.5% crit chance, stalwart's presence for 7.5% extra combat advantage, and I'm using the book imp for accuracy and combat advantage. And that's it for companions. So now we move to our mounts. On this main page here, you ideally want to be using a combat power here from your mounts that would give you high single target damage, like Golden Touch from the new mount which you can obtain from Hell Pit. You can also use your Giant Toad's Tongue Lash, and you can also use your Tunnel Vision. They all have the highest magnitude combat power damage. Then I'm using Opportunistic here in my equip power to give me that extra combat advantage, and then in my stable I have a bunch of these mounts here with a bunch of mythic collars. Now I'm mainly using insignias here, from mastery to dominance to skill to some brutals, and I believe that's it. As for the insignia bonuses themselves, I'm using 3 Warlord Inspirations to increase my companion damage. I'm not exactly sure if all of them work right now, and whether actually having a third just reduces the output of damage from your companion. I will have to test that specifically later, and I will do so in an upcoming video. Then I'm using 2 Assassin's Covenant, which increases the amount of offense stats but decreases the amount of defense stats I have, which definitely helps with giving this extra offense statistics for more damage. That's it then for the mounts, except these collars. These collars, ideally here you would have them on Mythic, but let's just be real. I'm on the preview server, so I could freely upgrade all of these to Mythic. Normally you'll just have them on Epic, as they're just insane to upgrade and there's not really much need other than the item level, which will give more damage. You can see this practical one won't matter whatsoever with regards to damage. This sturdy crescent one will give me encounter damage power, where in fact I would probably benefit more from an at-will damage one, since rogues have a lot of damage coming from their bleed, which is also at-will damage. Then we also have one down here to increase our movement speed, and another one to increase our critical severity. You can also switch to one which gives recharge speed, which is pretty good to reduce those lengthy cooldowns us rogues have. So finally we move over to boons. Boons in this section here, of course, you just want all the offense ones. So that's all the power here, all of these other 4 offense stats, and then you want to be just going in this movement speed, and I guess the ones that would give you extra damage against cultists, against fiends, against dinosaurs, and also against undead. They will help out depending on what content you're running with. And then other than there, you can just go in like hit points and other defense stats. You can also check out these potion ones as well. On tier 5, I'm running with Forte and recharge speed, and on my master boon, I'm running with Bloodlust. There are other options, of course. I did make a dedicated video to them, so you can also go and check that out if you want more in depth about which master boon is good for which situation. In my guild boons, I'm using this power one here, and I'm also using this defense one here. Utility, ideally you want Revive Sickness if you're running content where you might die. Revive Sickness will reduce the effects of the Resurrection Sickness, which will give you a reduction in 10% damage, and I believe it's 10% hit points. So you want to watch out for that, and this Revive Sickness will basically reduce the effect by a half. So finally we go to what buffs am I using to help me obtain these statistics. When I'm in combat and fully procced up, you can see I can gain those stacks nice and high there, and there we have it. We're pretty much capped on everything except accuracy. Those crit ones are messing around, but there we go. Nice solid 4 green numbers. And so yeah, let's go over which buffs I'm using. Well, we're using this watermelon sorbet for accuracy and power. We're using this guild food seared tuna for extra critical strike. We're using superior flask potency for extra critical severity and also some offense stats, and wildstorm elixir for extra critical strike and critical severity. They're all very good for buffing up those offense statistics. Then our invocation blessing, where again we used there to gain a critical strike. And finally you can also use this diamond's blessing to increase your damage by 5% for 15 minutes if you want to be somewhat of a tryhard. Anyway, with my overloads, I am of course using a Devil's Precision overload, 5% crit chance and 5% accuracy, and finally I'm also using a Rage of Flames overload for 5% total damage bonus. I only really recommend using these overloads if you're really trying to be competitive with DPS and you need to maximize your output. Anyway, with that said, that's going to be everything for this build. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I'll most likely go and reply to you guys when I can. With that said, hopefully I presented this well. If I did, consider leaving the video a like, and if you're new around here, consider subscribing. I will see you guys around. Goodbye for now.